The sun was merciless, beating down on the desert as though the sky itself wished to burn the earth into nothingness. Heat shimmered in waves across the cracked ground, distorting the horizon into a cruel mirage that seemed to dance just out of reach. 12-year-old Eliza swayed on her feet, her throat so dry it felt like sandpaper had scraped it raw. Every breath she pulled in tasted of dust, and her small boots sank slightly into the powdery grit with each step. The wind, dry and sharp, whipped against her torn bonnet and stung her cheeks, as though even the air wanted her gone. That was when she realized her father's horse tracks were fading, because they were growing too far away. Her knees buckled, and she dropped into the hot sand. The tracks cut across the plain like scars, two narrow lines pressed into the earth, leading away toward the burning horizon. She stared at them in disbelief, her vision wavering with dizziness. Surely he would come back. Surely he couldn't leave his own daughter here. But the longer she looked, the more she understood he was gone. She had begged him not to. She had run after his stirrup, clutching at his boot, choking on tears as she cried, "Papa, don't leave me here. Please, I'll try harder. Please." The only answer had been the horse's snort and the heavy silence of his jaw. Then, before the desert swallowed him, his voice had cut sharp and final. "A burden don't survive in the desert, girl. Better you learn it now." The words echoed in her skull, crueler than the sun overhead. Her chest heaved with sobs, but no tears came. Even her body refused to waste water. She pressed her dirty hands into the sand, trying to push herself up again, but the world spun around her. Her bonnet slipped from her head, tumbling across the ground until the wind carried it away. Her blonde hair, tangled and brittle with dust, stuck to her damp forehead. "Papa!" The word cracked in her throat, too dry to carry. Everywhere she looked, the desert stretched endless and empty. There were no houses, no streams, no trees, just a scattering of brittle sagebrush and jagged rocks that glowed red in the sunlight. The horizon bent upward in a haze that made her dizzy to watch. The silence pressed in heavy and absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling far above. Waiting for weakness to claim her, Eliza dug her fingernails into her palm, willing herself not to panic. Her father had always told her that fear killed faster than hunger or thirst. But how could she not be afraid when every bone in her small body ached and her lips split whenever she tried to speak? She thought of her mother, who had died when she was just a baby, and wondered if this was the same way she'd felt in her final moments, alone, helpless, abandoned by love. A hot gust of wind swept sand against her face. She flinched, blinking rapidly, but the grit still scraped her eyes. She rubbed at them until they watered, leaving faint muddy streaks down her cheeks. Her body trembled. The world seemed to shrink around her, the desert no longer a vast open place but a cage. Each breath heavier than the last. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly, whispering fragments of prayers she half remembered from her mother's old hymns. Maybe someone would come. Maybe God would see her here, left behind like trash, and send help. But the desert didn't answer. Her thoughts wandered to her father again, his lined, weathered face, his eyes narrowed with bitterness. He had lost the ranch, lost the cattle, lost everything but his pride. And pride, she thought, was what had left her here. Pride that saw her as useless. Pride that could ride away without looking back. She pressed her cheek into the hot ground, too weak to sit upright anymore. Her skin stung where it touched the earth, but she barely felt it. The sky above spun in wide, blinding circles. A strange buzzing filled her ears, low and steady, like bees trapped inside her skull. Still, she clung to one stubborn thought, that someone, somewhere would not leave her to die. That her life meant something more than her father's final words. But in that moment, Lying in the dust, her body small against the endless desert, even hope felt like another cruel trick of the heat. And then, just as her eyelids sagged, heavy as stones, she thought she saw it, a shape on the ridge, a shadow against the burning sky, but perhaps it was only another mirage. The desert was still, the kind of stillness that presses against the skin and weighs down the chest. When Eliza first noticed the shape against the horizon, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her again. The heat made the air waver and bend, turning rocks into shifting figures and cactus into men carrying rifles. More than once she had stumbled toward what she thought was water, only to collapse into sand. But this shadow was different. It didn't flicker with the heat or vanish when she blinked. It stood tall, steady, fixed upon the ridge like a sentinel carved from stone. Her breath caught. The shape began to move. Slowly, it stepped forward, each motion deliberate as if the desert itself made way for him. A horse followed, a lean Mustang with muscles rippling under the sun, its mane tied with strips of cloth dot. As he drew closer, Eliza's heart thudded hard in her chest. She could see him now, not a mirage, not a dream, but a man. His skin glowed bronze under the sun, his body bare except for leggings and moccasins. Long black hair, shining despite the dust, fell in braids down his back, woven with eagle feathers and strands of turquoise beads. His eyes, sharp and dark as flint, locked onto hers. Eliza froze. She knew the stories her father told. Apaches. Take children. They'll never bring you back. They'll paint their faces with your blood. Fear surged through her veins, urging her to scramble away, to hide, but her body was too weak. Her arms shook as she tried to push herself upright, and she collapsed again into the sand. The man did not speak. He came closer, his steps silent, measured. Even the horse behind him seemed to tread without sound. Eliza's mouth opened, a croak escaping. Stay back. The words cracked in her throat, but he gave no reaction. When he reached her, he did not loom or threaten. He crouched, lowering himself so his face was level with hers. His eyes studied her not with cruelty, but with a deep, unreadable calm. She trembled, clutching at the folds of her ragged dress. From a pouch at his side, he pulled a deerskin flask. He tipped it forward, holding it out so she could see the glisten of water spilling at the lip. Eliza's heart lurched. Her body screamed. For it, every part of her burning with thirst. But fear tangled with need. What if it's a trick? What if it's poison? The warrior said nothing. He simply waited, arms steady, water shimmering in the heat. Eliza licked her cracked lips, her eyes darting between his face and the flask. She thought of her father's warning, never trust them. They'll smile and kill you in the same breath. But the man before her wasn't smiling. He wasn't threatening. His silence was heavier than any words, but in that silence there was no malice, only patience. Her hand shook violently as she reached for the flask. The leather was cool against her skin. She raised it to her lips, the first drops shocking her tongue with life. She swallowed greedily, coughing as she gulped too fast. He steadied the flask with one hand, guiding it so she wouldn't choke. Water was warm, tasted of earth and leather, but to her it was sweeter than anything she'd ever known. Tears blurred her vision. She didn't realize she was crying until the drops streaked down her dust-stained cheeks. When she finally pulled the flask away, gasping, she whispered, "Thank you." The warrior's gaze lingered, unreadable. He gave a single slow nod. Then he stood, tall against the sun, and lifted her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. Eliza gasped in surprise, but her body was too weak to resist. She clutched his shoulder, feeling the hard muscle beneath his skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He carried her to the Mustang, its painted symbols glowing faintly in the sunlight, red handprints, white streaks of lightning, a black spiral over its flank. With one smooth motion, he placed her upon the horse's back and swung up behind her. His arms closed around her, not possessive, not cruel, but firm, protective. The mustang snorted and began to move, hooves drumming softly against the sand. Each step carried them farther from the place where she had been left to die. The desert. Wind tugged at her hair, but for the first time since her father abandoned her, Eliza didn't feel small and forgotten. She felt safe, and yet her mind whispered questions she dared not speak. Who was he? Why had he saved her? What would he do with her now? Behind them, the horse tracks of her father had already vanished, swallowed by the desert. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and unknown. The only sound was the steady beat of hooves and the silence of the warrior who had refused to let her go. The mustang moved with a rhythm that echoed in Eliza's bones, each hoofbeat striking the desert floor like a drum. The warrior sat tall and steady behind her, his powerful frame anchoring her fragile body as though nothing in the world could shake him. His arms, though silent and still, were a fortress close enough to shield her, yet never cruel, never trapping. Eliza clung to the horse's coarse black mane, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. Every step of the mustang sent jolts through her weak body, and her head swayed with exhaustion. The warrior's hand shifted once, lightly pressing against her back to straighten her, the way a father steadies a child learning to walk. She flinched at first, unused to such wordless care, but soon found herself leaning into his strength. Desert stretched endlessly around them, painted gold and copper beneath the late sun. Heat waves shimmered like restless spirits dancing along the horizon. The air carried the bitter scent of sagebrush and the dry tang of dust, filling her nose and throat. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked, sharp and lonely, but the sound only made the silence of the warrior more profound. Eliza tried to speak. Where were we going? Her voice was hoarse, cracked by thirst despite the water she'd been given. The man gave no answer. He didn't even glance down. He only pressed his knees into the mustang's sides, guiding it with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his whole life in communion with the animal. Her father's warnings came rushing back again, each one sour on her tongue. They'll never talk to you. They don't need to. They'll do what they will, and you won't have a say. Yet as she studied the profile of the warrior's face, sharp against the sky, she saw no cruelty carved there. His silence wasn't harsh or mocking, it was something heavier, purposeful, as though words were not enough to hold what he carried inside. The horse slowed as they descended a shallow gully, its hooves sinking into softer ground. Eliza blinked at the sight-faint green grass sprouting between stones, a trickle of water seeping from the earth. The warrior dismounted in one smooth motion and lifted her down as easily as if she were a bundle of feathers. Setting her on a rock near the tiny spring, he crouched to fill his flask, then offered it to her again. This time she didn't hesitate. She drank slowly, remembering how she'd nearly choked before. The water, though little more than a sip, soothed her throat and cooled her lips. She whispered another small, shaky thank you, but he gave no reply. Instead, he turned to the horse, stroking its neck, whispering words in a language she couldn't understand, soft, low sounds, more like music than speech. Eliza wrapped her arms around her knees, watching him. In the silence between them, her fear tangled with curiosity. Who was he? Why had he stopped for her when her own father had not? And where was he taking her? When he returned to her side, he crouched again and studied her face. His eyes were piercing, unblinking, but not unkind. With the tip of his finger, he pointed at her chest, then to his own heart. The gesture was strange, foreign, yet it made her heartbeat quicken. Was he asking if she was strong? Or was he promising that she would be safe? Eliza nodded faintly, not sure what else to do. The warrior gave another single, deliberate nod in return, as if a silent agreement had passed between them. The journey resumed. Back on the Mustang, she felt the desert wind whip at her hair, stinging her skin with grit. But the steady rhythm of the horse, the warrior's silent presence, and the faint beat of his heart against her back created a strange sense of calm. For the first time since her father left her, Eliza let her eyes close. She drifted in and out of a half-sleep, lulled by the rocking motion of the horse. When she startled awake at one point, the warrior was still there, silent and unmoving. Eyes fixed on the horizon like a guardian watching over her. It struck her then. This man, this stranger, hadn't spoken a single word to her. Yet somehow, in his silence, he had given her more comfort than her father ever had in all his sharp, bitter talk. The desert night began to rise, stars pricking the velvet sky. As the Mustang climbed another ridge, Eliza clutched the horses, mane tighter, and whispered, barely audible, "Don't let me go." The warrior didn't speak. He only tightened his hold ever so slightly, an unspoken vow carried in silence. Night dropped swiftly upon the desert, as if the sun had been torn down and the sky sewn shut with black cloth. The air that had burned Eliza's skin by day now cooled so sharply that gooseflesh crawled across her arms. She shivered on the horse, until the warrior slowed and brought the Mustang to a stop near a cluster of boulders. He dismounted first, landing with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the earth itself. Then he lifted her down as though she were weightless, his strong arms steadying her unsteady legs. Without a word, he led the horse to graze on sparse tufts of grass between the rocks, then set about gathering sticks and brushwood. Eliza hugged herself, small and fragile, as she watched him work. His movements were efficient, deliberate, snapping dry cedar branches, striking flint against steel. Sparks flared, catching on the brush until flames rose, crackling into life. The smell of burning wood filled the night air, sharp but comforting, and warmth spread against the chill. The warrior reached into a pouch and drew out a folded blanket of woven wool, patterned with bold geometric shapes of red and black. He placed it around her shoulders without a word. The fabric was rough, yet warm, and Eliza pulled it tightly around her, hiding her trembling fingers in its folds. For the first time since her father's departure, she let herself cry. It began as a soft hiccup, then grew into sobs that racked her small chest. She buried her face in the blanket, ashamed of her weakness but powerless to stop the flood. The warrior didn't move to hush her, didn't turn away in disgust the way her father always had. He simply sat across the fire, cross-legged, his eyes reflecting the flames, silent, steady. Listening. Through broken breaths, she whispered the truth words she had swallowed all day, words that had burned holes in her chest. He left me, said I was too weak, too slow, said I'd only slow him down. Her voice cracked, tears blurring her sight. I ran after him. I begged him not to leave me. But he wouldn't even look back. The warrior's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with something fierce, a glint of fire behind the calm. Yet he did not speak. Instead, he picked up a stick and dragged its end through the sand by the firelight. Eliza sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, and watched. He drew simple shapes, a jagged line of mountains, a blazing sun above, then a single figure standing tall. Beneath it, he marked a second line, this one unbroken, like a river flowing steady through the land. She frowned, tilting her head. What does it mean? He looked at her then, eyes piercing, and tapped the figure once with the stick. Then he touched his own chest, then hers. Eliza's throat tightened. She didn't understand all of it, not really. But somehow, She felt the weight of the promise behind his gesture. It was as if he were telling her she was not meant to vanish in this desert, that she too could stand, endure, flow like that river he had drawn. The fire popped, sparks spiraling into the night sky. Around them, the desert sang its eerie songs, coyotes howling in the distance, owls calling from unseen perches, the sigh of the wind weaving through rocks. Eliza curled closer to the fire, the blanket wrapped around her small body, and watched the warrior across from her. His skin glowed bronze. In the firelight, his tribal jewelry catching glints of red and gold from the flames. He was like a figure from a story, half real, half legend. Exhaustion pulled at her eyelids, but fear still lurked at the edges of her mind. What if her father came back with men? What if this warrior grew tired of her weakness and left her too? The thoughts pricked like thorns, but as she watched him sit there, unmoving, watching the fire as though guarding both it and her, a fragile calm began to settle over her. She had never known safety like this, not even in her father's house. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a simple, desperate hope. Please, don't let him leave me too. And for that night, at least, the fire's glow and the warrior's silence wrapped around her like a shield. The desert greeted them at dawn with fire. When Eliza opened her eyes, she was lying beneath the woven blanket, the embers of the campfire glowing faintly beside her. The warrior was already awake, crouched near the Mustang, checking its hooves, his silhouette outlined by the pale pink glow of the rising sun. The air was sharp with morning chill, but Eliza knew the heat would return soon, harsher than ever. Her lips were cracked again, thirst gnawing at her belly like a wild animal. She sat up slowly, hugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The warrior glanced at her once, then held out a piece of cactus flesh, pale and wet, cut neatly with his knife. She hesitated before taking it. The pulp was slippery in her small hands, sticky with juice. She bit into it, grimacing at the bitter taste, but her mouth came alive with relief as moisture spread across her tongue. She devoured every bit, even licking her fingers, too desperate to care. The warrior said nothing, only nodded once, as if approving that she had chosen survival over disgust. Then he rose, lifted her onto the Mustang, and together they rode into the endless sea of sand and stone. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, smothering the land. Waves of it shimmered off the rocks, bending the horizon into a trembling line. Eliza swayed in the saddle, her head heavy, her throat already dry again. Each breath carried the taste of dust, each step of the Mustang sending jolts of weariness through her bones. Her body wanted to give up, but the warrior did not allow it. When she began to slump, he tapped her shoulder firmly, guiding her upright. When she closed her eyes too long, he clicked his tongue sharply, the sound startling her awake. And when she groaned, "I can't," he pressed his hand gently against her chest where her heart beat fast and frantic, and then pointed to the horizon. It wasn't words, but she understood. "You can. You must." Hours dragged by. The warrior finally slowed the Mustang and dismounted, lifting Eliza down. Her legs trembled as she stood on the hot ground, dizzy with exhaustion. He crouched low, pressing his ear against the sand, then motioned for her to do the same. Confused, she obeyed, lowering her head to the ground. At first she heard nothing but the blood rushing in her ears. But then faint, distant, the murmur of water. A trickle, maybe a stream. Her eyes widened. She lifted her head quickly, but he pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence, then pointed toward a cluster of rocks where scrubby green bushes grew. Together they moved slowly, carefully, the warrior leading her by the hand. And there, hidden in the shade of stone, a small pool glistened, no bigger than a basin, but alive, real. Eliza's heart leapt. She ran forward, dropping to her knees, cupping the cool liquid into her hands. She drank until her belly hurt. Gasping with joy, the warrior knelt beside her, filling his flask with measured care. Then he motioned for her to stop. She blinked at him, confused. "But I'm still thirsty." He tapped the side of his head, then gestured to his stomach, then shook his head. Slowly, she realized what he meant. Too much would sicken her. Her body had to be patient, disciplined. For the first time, she smiled faintly. He was teaching her, not just saving her, but showing her how to live in a land that wanted her gone. As the sun climbed higher, they rested in the shadows of the rocks. The warrior cut more cactus, showed her which plants could be chewed for moisture, which should be avoided. He placed small stones in her mouth, and when she frowned, he demonstrated by sucking one himself the trick of fooling the body into producing spit. She copied him, surprised at the small comfort it gave. Every movement of his body spoke of knowledge, carved from a lifetime in the desert. His silence no longer frightened her. It guided her, steadied her, gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. When she stumbled later that afternoon, her knees giving way, he caught her before she hit the ground. His arms wrapped around her firmly, lifting her as if she were nothing more than a bundle of feathers. For a heartbeat, she buried her face against his chest, hearing the steady thrum of his heart, strong, unyielding, alive. Her father's words, a father's words, a father's words of the of his heart, strong, unyielding, alive. Her father's words, asada, to ring the steady thrum of his heart. Burden don't survive echoed once more in her mind. But this warrior's silence told her something different. That even the smallest flame could be shielded, kept alive, made to burn brighter. For the first time, Eliza began to believe she was not a burden. She was a life worth carrying. The morning sun burned the desert awake, scattering long shadows across the dunes as if the land itself was whispering secrets. Eliza stirred beneath the woven blanket, her thin body stiff and aching, but when she opened her eyes, she saw him. The warrior stood a few feet away, shirtless, bronze skin gleaming in the rising light, his long black hair loose and catching in the wind. A hawk circled above him, its cry sharp and lonely, and for a moment he looked more spirit than man. He did not speak, but when her eyes met his, he lifted a hand and motioned for her to rise. She pushed herself up, wobbling like a colt on unsteady legs. Every muscle in her small body protested, but something in his gaze, firm, patient, unyielding, made her obey. The desert was no place for the weak. And she was beginning to understand. He meant to make her stronger. He pointed to the horizon, where distant mesquite trees marked the faint line of water. Then, stooping, he picked up a branch, pressed it into her hands, and traced the shape of the sun in the sand. Slowly, carefully, he showed her how to follow its arc, how direction could be pulled from the sky itself. Eliza squinted against the glare, trying to understand, trying not to fail. He corrected her grip on the stick, his hand firm but gentle, guiding her movements. When she managed to mimic his mark with some accuracy, he gave a single nod. Not a smile, not a word but approval. And somehow, that single nod filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The lesson didn't stop there. He led her to a dry ravine, its cracked floor seeming lifeless. Eliza dragged her feet, her throat still raw, her limbs weak. But when he crouched low and pressed his ear to the earth, she followed. He tapped the ground, then picked up a stone, cracking it against another. A faint dampness seeped up between the cracks, darker than the surrounding dirt. With his knife, he dug quickly, and soon water seeped into the hollow. Eliza gasped, her eyes wide. "There's water underneath?" He met her gaze but said nothing. Instead, he handed her a flat stone and gestured for her to dig alongside him. She hesitated, then knelt and scraped at the earth until her hands ached, until the trickle grew into a small puddle. Mud caked her fingers, filled the cracks of her nails. When she lifted her filthy hands, ashamed, he reached forward and pressed them back into the soil, nodding once more as if to say, "This is right." This is how you survive. By midday, she was exhausted, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but there was a glimmer in her eyes. She had never thought herself capable of such things. Her father had always told her she was frail, useless, a burden. Yet here she was, drawing water from the earth with her own hands. When the sun dipped lower, the warrior finally spoke. His voice was deep, low, almost like the rumble of thunder far away. Te Heroine. Eliza blinked. What does that mean? He paused, searching her face, then touched his chest. Strong. Her lips parted, her small chest tightening with something that felt like pride. The word was foreign, heavy, but she clung to it like a lifeline. Strong? That evening they returned to the fire. Eliza wrapped herself in the blanket, her hands blistered, her body sore, but she smiled faintly. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was learning. The warrior sat opposite her, silent as always, his figure glowing in the firelight. The flicker of flames danced against his tribal jewelry, against the sharp lines of his face. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of him. For the first time, she felt safe. As the coyotes sang to the night, Eliza whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." He didn't respond, not with words. But he turned his head slightly, and though his face remained carved from stone, his eyes softened with something unspoken, something that told her she was no longer alone. And in that silence, the desert did not feel so empty anymore. The moon rose high over the desert, pale and cold, casting silver light across the sand and rocks. Eliza lay wrapped in the woolen blanket, her small body pressed against the warrior's side as they rested near a sparse cluster of mesquite trees. The fire they had built earlier burned low, embers glowing like tiny stars against the dark earth. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and the faint thrum of his heart beneath his chest. Somehow, in the warmth of his presence, in the vast emptiness of the desert, she felt more alive than she had ever felt in her short, abandoned life. Morning came again with the harsh clarity of desert sun. The warrior rose silently, stretching his massive arms, his long black hair catching the light like silk, tribal jewelry flashing faintly with each movement. Eliza scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt from her dress, still weak but growing stronger. Each day, the warrior motioned for her to follow, and together they set out across the dunes. The Mustang trotted steadily beside them, muscles rippling, its painted symbols gleaming white lightning streaks, red handprints, and the black spiral across its flank. The desert seemed less threatening now, less a prison and more a vast, living world that they navigated together. Hours passed, the sun climbing high. The warrior taught her to read the sand, to spot subtle signs of water, to identify plants that could sustain her. He never spoke aloud, but every gesture, every look, every touch was instruction. Eliza learned patience, endurance, and trust. With each small triumph, finding water, catching shade, surviving the blistering heat, her confidence grew. By mid-afternoon, they reached the crest of a ridge overlooking a hidden valley. The warrior dismounted, lifting Eliza down from the horse with effortless strength. Her legs wobbled, but she held herself upright, eyes wide with awe. Below them, a spring bubbled, surrounded by green reeds and small flowering plants, an oasis, hidden from the harsh desert winds. The warrior crouched beside the water, cupping it into his hands. He offered it to her, and she drank, savoring every drop. Then he pressed a hand against his chest and tapped gently on her heart. She understood immediately. He was telling her that strength came not only from survival, but from courage, from endurance, from believing in herself. Eliza felt a warmth swell in her chest. a deep and steady fire that no desert sun could scorch. Her eyes met the warrior's, dark and unyielding, yet filled with something she could not name: pride, approval, guardianship. He had saved her from death, yes, but more than that, he had shown her her own strength. They rested at the spring, the water reflecting sunlight in tiny, sparkling waves. The warrior poured water over the Mustang's mane, then let Eliza do the same, laughing softly as droplets caught her hair and skin. For the first time, the desert felt like a place of life, of possibility, not just danger. As night approached, once more, Eliza nestled against the warrior. The fire crackled, the stars stretched endlessly above, and she whispered, "Thank you for everything." He did not answer with words. Instead, he placed a large calloused hand over hers, there, fingers brushing, and nodded once, deliberately. It was a vow, a promise that he would never abandon her as her father had done. In that moment, she realized that she had found more than protection in him. She had found a guardian, a teacher, and a bond that transcended fear, desert, and abandonment. She was no longer just a girl left to die. She was a survivor, a child of the land, strong enough to endure because someone had refused to let her go. The desert winds whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and earth. The warrior rose, scanning the horizon, silent as ever, his body bronze and proud, his long black hair braided and flowing, tribal jewelry glinting. Eliza followed, her step steadier now, her eyes bright with determination. And together, they walked, the desert vast and eternal, but no longer empty. They moved forward as guardian and child, teacher and pupil, bound by silence, strength, and the unspoken promise that neither would be left behind again. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, golden, harsh, and alive, and for the first time, Eliza knew she could survive anything, as long as he was beside her.